while people are still straggling into the meeting. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're calling from. My name is Frank Riley. I am a senior M&E analyst at IDEAL. I'd like to welcome you to this session, which we've entitled Field-Based Monitoring Strategies for HDP Coherence. With this session, we're going to open the second thematic area of IDEAL's knowledge sharing series. And this thematic area will focus on data for decision-making. Before we start, I'd like to inform everybody that this session will be recorded and that we are providing interpretation in French. So please, I'd like to invite everyone to select their preferred language for this session. You can do so by clicking the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting either English or French. You can choose to mute the original audio or listen to it at a lower volume while you hear the translation. At any time during the event, if you have questions or comments, please use this chat box feature. We have people who are monitoring it, and we'll make sure that these questions and comments are get into the conversation. Just as a general reminder and overview, we opened the knowledge sharing series back in June. We've had two major sets of conversations so far. And this is thematic area number 2, data for decision-making in HDP coherence. We will have this event today and similar events at the same time tomorrow and on Thursday, dealing with data for decision-making. Having worked in the development of data systems for multiple decades, I see all field-based monitoring activities, which includes context monitoring, crisis monitoring, early warning, and even resilience monitoring, as being very similar. Each is designed to provide a situational awareness to decision makers in near real time, which is critically important for programs. But each also provides an analytical perspective that can be very different and specific to their particular program's purpose. Each of these tools provides an input into a shock responsive and adaptive program management approach that is central to work on HDP coherence. So today, we will explore how we can collect data from context monitoring, resilience monitoring, conflict monitoring, and other field-based monitoring systems to support HDP coherence in programming. Excuse me. I'd like to welcome our speakers for today, Andrea Barboza, who is Mercy Corps' Crisis Analytics Lead Analyst in DRC. Andrea's work is rooted in emergency programming, but her team is finding increased application of their efforts in the development and peace sectors. Andrea will be sharing the stage with Greg Makabila, who is the MEAL Deputy Chief of Party for CRS Ethiopia's BHA-funded activity. Greg's work on context monitoring is rooted in development, but his activity shares data extensively with emergency programs in Ethiopia. I think the conversation between Andrea and Greg will be really interesting today. And then to direct this dynamic dialogue, we have Dr. Nancy Mock from Tulane University, who, among others, is a member of the Interagency Technical Working Group on Resilience Measurement and has an extensive range of experience designing food security-related information systems. Nancy was actually my boss back in the 1990s when we were both working on the FuseNet activity while she was at Tulane. Before passing it over to Nancy, please click the link in the chat to access a complimentary resource that will provide you with more information about our speakers' activities and the data systems they are currently using. And with that, I'll pass it over to Nancy. Thank you all.
Great. Good morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you are. It's great to be with you. And, you know, one of the things that Frank didn't put enough safeguards, because this is my passion, data for decision making. And as he alluded, FuseNet was my was one of my first jobs actually after I got my doctorate. And just a little icebreaker. So I was sent out to the Sahel during the height of a famine to develop an early warning system. And there were all sorts of issues with this project, but suffice it to say that I ended up being a co-creator of what is currently the famine early warning system. So it was a pretty rough ride and very interesting. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our two panelists about sort of the new generation of monitoring and data for decision making. So with that, I'll kick it off just by asking the two panelists to talk a little bit about their positions and the objectives of their work. So Greg, would you like to start?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So I work in Ethiopia with the Catholic Youth Services as Deputy Chief of Party. Deputy Chief of Party for MIL. MIL is Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability, and Learning. And my role as the DCOP for MIL is to lead the design and implementation of our robust MIL system so that we collect data and use it for learning and adaptive management. And currently in this particular session, I'll be talking about one of our context monitoring innovations, which we call MIRA. MIRA standing for Monthly Interval Resiliency Analysis. Thank you.
Andrea, please.
Hi, Nancy. Thanks again. Nice to be here. So my name is Andrea Barbosa, and I currently work as the Congo Humanitarian Analysis Team's lead analyst here at Mercy Corps DRC. I am essentially responsible for the development and delivery of this team's entire product catalog, which ranges from regular analytical reports on the evolution of the humanitarian situation, displacement trends, scenario forecast, and then more ad hoc products that are relevant to specific themes within the humanitarian or development sector. I must say that the Congo HAT is part of a global department within Mercy Corps called Crisis Analytics. And essentially, Crisis Analytics, what it does is aggregate and analyze data to support programmatic and operational decision-making in complex crises. So just as the Congo Humanitarian Analysis Team, there are other crisis analytics units deployed in several countries that are experiencing crises. And yeah, so for this session, I will be presenting our stability score, which was developed last year in the framework of one of our biggest development programs here in DRC.
Great, fantastic. Well, one of our charges here today is to talk about how these monitoring activities inform humanitarian development and peace building activities. And so I'd like to start with maybe your origin story, Greg, as to how your monitoring approaches came to be and what was your original mandate?
So thank you. This is another phase of a RIFSA. So we had a RIFSA that ended in September last year, in September, October. During that RIFSA, we had about 5 critical assumptions within our theory of change. And those assumptions included things like pandemic, and epidemic, and then security, etc. What really happened is that all the assumptions came to pass, and they questioned our entire theory of change and made it like they helped us to think of how do we monitor our context in a way that we can take action to increase our chances of succeeding in an environment where contextual shocks are inevitable, because that's the area where we live right now. So this triggered us to look around within the Catholic Youth Services, and we ended up in Malawi and Madagascar, who had been implementing the MIRA initiative. MIRA, like I said earlier, it stands for monthly interval resilience analysis. And they have done some good work to the point of the governments of the two countries, especially Malawi, had adopted it, and they had received a lot of scale up because of how useful it was in resilience analysis. So when we brought it to Ethiopia, our main interest was to use that approach to monitor our context in a rigorous way and in a way that helps us to answer three key questions. First question is, what shocks are our people facing as a result of what we put in our theory of change? How are they responding to these shocks, and what kind of interventions are working and which ones are not working in terms of making sure they are less affected by the context? So that's how we ended up developing the MIRA for Ethiopia as a context monitoring initiative. So a bit about MIRA, it is a high frequency monitoring system. We collect data on a monthly basis, and we analyze this data and bring it back to the program to make adaptive management decision and also to help us with our scenario planning. And we are working on embedding a machine learning and advanced analytics component that will allow us to make better decisions about our clients now and for the future. We work together with Cornell University and as well as the local governments within Ethiopia, and we share data across different programs, including the Joint Emergency Operations and other non-governmental organizations within the areas where we work. Thank you very much.
Great, that's a really rich discussion, and we'll get back in a few minutes to how that information is actually being used to guide programming. But Andrea, would you like to provide us with your story, which comes at it from a different perspective in terms of the humanitarian side?
Sure. Originally, the Congo Hat was built as an analysis unit within Mercy Corps' emergency department here in DRC. And more specifically, it was a big component, and it was factored in one of DRC's biggest rapid response program here in the East. So the origin story of the Congo Hat is actually an analysis unit that developed an early warning system for population displacement caused mainly by armed conflict, to be able to alert humanitarian responders on where were the people with the most humanitarian needs. This early warning system was also a direct response to donor requirements who were asking to increase anti-fraud measures, including enhanced verification of displacement alerts, so population displacement alerts. Because in 2019, around 2019, a big operational review uncovered that displacement alerts was a big source of aid diversion in Eastern Congo. So that's where we come from. Today, the Congo Humanitarian Analysis Team is actually a mission level support unit that basically provides Mercy Corps DRC and its partners with data to support decision making for programs all through the triple nexus. So now we support data-driven decision making, not only for humanitarian actors, but also development and peace building actors.
Great, Andrea. So tell me a little bit more about that. How is information being used across the pillars that you provide?
Yes, so this is basically how our tool, our stability score came to life, and the reason why we decided to create a new tool. It was a way to collaborate and inform new actors or new stakeholders we would start engaging with. And we needed to adapt our information cycle to their information needs. So the first big collaboration we set up with a development or resilience program, as we call them in Mercy Corps, was with SWASA, which is a 5-year-long USAID-funded program treating with based on water governance and access to water. This program is implemented by a consortium which is led by Mercy Corps, and we reached out to this development program last year to see what were the opportunities to collaborate. And they presented a number of context hypotheses from their program's logical framework, and basically said, well, you know, would you be able to help us monitor these hypotheses? And this is how we actually, and the hypotheses, the contextual hypotheses, were very much related to the stability, right? Like trying to understand whether the context would, the political, economic, and security context would remain sufficiently stable to allow program activities to be implemented, whether the intervention sites that had been identified would remain accessible throughout the duration of the program. And this is how our stability score came to life. So it basically analyzes program's contextual hypotheses through a scoring system and informs the program on the evolution of that context to ultimately, you know, have the program understand its ability to contribute or not to their theory of change, right? Based on these external factors that might affect their activities. The tool in itself, the stability score, studies 4 different dimensions which are related to the initial context hypotheses that SWASA presented to us. These dimensions are political, economic, security, and physical accessibility. And from these 4 dimensions of study, we identified a series of indicators within each one. There are between 4 to 7 indicators per dimension. And the data we collected for each indicator was then scored through an index from 1 to 6. And the average score from all of these 4 different dimensions became sort of like a small screenshot that we were providing the program team on the context for each of their intervention sites. So, I mean, I think I've provided an image to better illustrate how our stability score plays a role with the rest of the program's life cycle and especially its logical framework. And basically we come in to provide support for the non-programmatic aspect of the program implementation.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, very nice summary of what you're doing in Congo. Greg, would you like to talk about this issue of how the information links across the 3 pillars?
Yes, so the nature of our program, because of where it is, it's in the Oromia region of Ethiopia, 9 warriors of that region. And that region is hardly hit most of the time by shocks. Like most recently, drought ravaged some of the places and we witnessed a lot of livestock death, among other things. So this tells us that our clients are sometimes in an emergency situation and sometimes in a development situation. So the way this data becomes useful for us, it helps us to identify which client need which type of intervention at a time. The second contextual issue is that there are many stakeholders on the ground. For example, out of our 9 implementing WOREDAs or districts, 4 of them are shared with a program we call the Joint Emergency Operations. And there are also other government programs within the different areas which also come in to help in the situation of emergency. So the most useful way of this that we can use this data at a point is all these stakeholders need to have access to the information and they make decision on response. In our consultation with the zonal and WOREDA governments during the setup of the MIRA, one of the biggest issues they raised was the need to push the use of the data for response among the different actors. Now, Ethiopia is at its initial stages in terms of developing MIRA, but there is substantial success in Malawi, or now this information has been used across different actors. For example, the Department of Disaster Management Affairs in Malawi has largely used this data in examining the effectiveness of response efforts, more specifically providing information on the recovery trajectory of households impacted by certain shocks. And that's just one of the ways that the data has been used across the different actors. But the main point is that a strong stakeholder analysis that we have already done is helping us to really determine what happens to that. Within the program itself, our clients move from emergency to development. For example, when drought came in Ethiopia this year, we noticed out of our 9 WOREDAs, 2 of them were substantially affected by the drought compared to the other 7 that were remaining. So there's a fund we call the contingency fund, which is 5% of the fund of the commodity distribution that we normally provide to the clients. So instead of distributing this commodity across all the 9 WOREDAs, we now focused intensively on the 2 that were most significantly affected by the drought. So that's one of the specific examples that you can take from this situation. Thank you.
Yes, Greg, I'd like you to say maybe a little bit more about how this information has informed decision-making and particularly layering of humanitarian assistance in development areas. Can you explain a little bit more? I mean, you talked about targeting WOREDAs for contingency funds, but what about, has the emergency been larger and needed more than just the redirection of contingency funds? Have there been other uses of this data for larger humanitarian purposes?
So at the moment, we are not very deep into implementing the model because we are just within our first year. But one of the other areas we envision using this data within the context of Ethiopia is the issue of targeting and retargeting of clients, depending on the kind of shocks that they are facing. Like I mentioned earlier, the Joint Emergency Operations is a program that focuses mainly on the emergencies, and the RIFSA focus on resiliency and development. So because they work within the same framework, we are seeing potential use of the information in terms of targeting. Thank you.
Great. And Andrea, might you say a little bit more about how your data is being used for decision-making by development programs, perhaps even outside of the water wash activity?
Sure. So the main way the results from the stability score are being used today is, well, there are 2 main aspects that are important in terms of the uptake of this information. One of it is informing different components of the SWASA program, how to engage with stakeholders. As I said, it is a 5-year-long development program, but in a very volatile area, in a very volatile region. And one of the dimensions that we study is actually community acceptance and how Mercy Corps, but other like humanitarian actors in general are perceived, and how this can affect our access or our provision of aid to specific communities. And so one of the main things that the results are helping the program team understand is what actors they need to engage with to make sure that there are good channels of communication between the program and the communities. What are the specific, let's say, water actors or youth actors that need to be called to the table? And what are the different sort of communication adaptations that need to be done for the program objectives to be understood by the community and accepted. Another way that it's used is basically part of a Mercy Corps standard, general operating standard, which is being able to provide this enough sufficient data to adapt for adaptive management. So basically being able to continuously analyze how the context is evolving to then come back to a program team, and eventually it will be bigger than SWASA. It will include all actors, all Mercy Corps operations intervening in one area, and let them know how will the contextual situation affect their operations for them to be able to take an anticipated action. So adaptive management, I would say, is another way that the results are being used. And a little bit on the same line as Greg, currently the way the tool is structured, it's the indicators and the dimensions of study are broad enough for the information that we're providing to actually be useful for other actors that are maybe not engaged in water governance, but are engaged in displacement, rapid response programs or peace building. And this is basically what we're trying to work on now. So a methodological review of the tool to expand the scope of the information that we're providing and for it to be useful for other actors within the Triple Nexus programming.
Great. I think both of you have talked about this community dimension, as you know, for information system activities over time. I think one of our shortcomings has been how we involve community in these information system activities. And I know, Greg, MIRA is pretty particular in this respect. Do you want to say a little bit about how MIRA works and why the community engagement piece is particularly interesting?
Yes, thank you. So the way MIRA is structured is, unlike most of the early warning mechanisms within Ethiopia, which focus at community level, MIRA starts collecting data at household level. So in this regard, we have identified 44 kebeles and we collect data from 20 households. And when we get that data from the households, we analyze it and then we go back to them using our community engagement processes. And it basically means we have identified groups that existed already in the community that are handling early warning in most of our areas, where we sit with them and identify how do we take the results of this data forward? How do we use it to respond at our own level and develop better strategies of response? What kind of interventions are preferred or that are seen more useful for that? So that is a piece which is very important and is embedded within MIRA. The other piece that makes this approach useful is like, we do not get enumerators from outside the community. We have recruited 44 community embedded enumerators who live in those particular communities. So even though we may not be in a position to access the communities when some shocks hit, they are there to lead those processes of community engagement, to collect the data, and to really visit each household and find out what's happening. The third thing that is useful is that we have given them tablets that allows them to send us data as soon as the data is collected. So that allows us to have the data in very quick time, and we are able to respond. A good example of this is that in Malawi, I think a couple of months ago, the team of community embedded emulators collected data within a week after the shock. But when the government went to collect the data they were collecting a month later, they found the same, what they were looking for is exactly what the mirror system had actually collected. So that making it quickly, real time, and then at the same time having those young people embedded in the community and having the community engagement process that they're trained to facilitate is helping us a lot. The third thing I would like to mention is like this engagement process is not just done by CRS staff, it's done in partnership with the government or other government staff, who are the ones who actually take leadership on responding to shocks and talking to people about the shocks which affect them. So that's the community engagement piece that we have. Thank you.
And that's a very lovely story. And Andrea, would you like to say a little more about community engagement and how you've operationalized it in your crisis analytic activity?
Sure. I think, well, for this particular tool, we've approached community engagement differently because we rolled out the tool a few months after the project had started to implement in these four initial intervention sites. And so we based ourselves a lot on the presence of the program team there to reach different members of the community that we wanted to interview. However, crisis analytics DRC is, as I had said earlier, is basically based on this mandate that we need, our main objective is to be able to triangulate, have enough methodologies, rigorous methodologies put in place to triangulate information. And so we still applied this principle to our data collection for the stability score. We contacted our field networks in these areas already. We've identified, let's say, continuous key informant in different areas of Eastern Congo, and one of them is in North and South Kivu province, where this project in particular is being implemented. And so other than the actors that we identified through the program, we also contacted our field networks to be able to expand sort of like the scope of the population that we were going to be interviewing. I must say also we used a mixed methods approach. So quantitative and qualitative data collection, yes, but also other than that, a lot of the indicators were actually collected through secondary sources of information that we get from other humanitarian partners. So security, information on security incidents, we were being provided by INSO or ACLED. And so in a way, this is the innovative part of our data collection, which is not necessarily community-based, but it's based on available data sets and big data, and where we can actually make data collection more efficient, potentially in the future, because it's quite a heavy, it's a lot of indicators, And we realized during our pilots that it actually took us a long time to collect all of this primary data and roll out all of the surveys and identify the key informants. And so we now want to mix it up a bit more and base a lot of the information on secondary sources of information, and only when the score seems to be either incredibly low or incredibly high would we then go back to our field networks and sort of dig deeper into what is happening in this particular area in terms of economic changes, volatility, or political acceptance, credibility of NGOs, to better understand and give our program teams a deep dive into what specifically is a concern in an area.
Great. Now, both of you have made reference to analysis activities and sometimes the use of more advanced analytical techniques. And I'd wondered if you could say a little bit more about how you're analyzing the data first, and then how that's being presented to decision makers in what forms. Greg, you want to start?
Yes, I can start. So we collect different types of information. First of all, we collect information on shocks. We track shocks. We look at shocks, early warning, and migration. We also collect about coping strategies. How are people coping with these shocks? That is, we use the reduced coping strategies index. And then after that, we collect outcome data at household level. Things like data diversity. How are those shocks affecting data diversity? Things like off-farm initiatives and wages, are they going down or are they going up? Things like on-farm, are crops affected, are livestock affected? Are people leaving or joining groups? We also look at financial assets. And then lastly, we look at some WASH indicators and how they're, for example, water sources and sanitation. So that combination of data becomes useful programmatically and becomes useful for other stakeholders. So because we look at the shocks and the coping strategies, we are able to see whether people are adopting negative coping strategies, which sounds like an alarm warning for us, because we have a specific indicator we track in our M&D system, and which is also tracked by the government M&D system, that talks about the percent of households adopting or utilizing negative coping strategies. Now, when we get this information, the first thing is we bring it to our technical staff, because that's our first sphere of control. Since we have specific types of intervention, we can do that. Things we do in this regard include like developing concept notes to help us work on the emergencies that we are seeing on the ground and how they are affecting people. The second step is to look at the other actors within the country and the areas where we work based on our stakeholder analysis. And in this case, we intend to be sharing in big technical meetings, like the joint meetings we have with government at various levels, at whatever level. And the third place of sharing is converting this data into useful and usable formats that can be used at local level, at community level, which can be supported by our field level staff as well as the community embedded enumerators. In terms of the types of analysis, they're just knowing what is the problem with the shocks. What are the shocks? How big are they? How tough are they? How are they affecting the people? But we also try to identify why. So the why aspect comes in. We have a component in our M&D system that looks at qualitative analysis. And in that regard, when we see a shock is giving us unique information, we have resources to go and dig deeper through a qualitative study or qualitative monitoring to really find out how do we take it forward in terms of response. Thank you.
Great, and you, Andrea, could you talk a little bit more about the analysis and how that's presented to whom?
Sure. So our main audience for the final results is the program team and the different, let's say, team leaders of the program's different components, right? So governance, water, research, M&E, and they kind of are not only our main audience, but the people who are then responsible for the uptake of this information and passing it on to the rest of their teams, and then to the rest, to the communities. And when I say passing it on to the rest of their teams, is also engaging with the different components of a program and seeing how they need to be adapted, right? So basically, from analysis to dissemination of the results, we have various ways of various data collection approaches. So primary data collection was done through ComCare, so through tablets, which then were synced to the ComCare platform. And then we also collected all of the secondary data that came from secondary sources of information. And the moment where we start the analysis is actually when we're able to aggregate all of the data that we've collected and actually answer the main indicators, right? And so when we give each indicator a score, that automatically then averages like a global score for the political situation in a specific intervention site. And from that score, we then go back to a primary data collection approach, where we then dig deeper into, okay, so why is this score maybe so low, or why is physical accessibility so difficult right now? And then we would have to then dig deep into why this is happening, to give the program team in the report that we draft for them the reason, like the why for the score, right? We also we give a result restitution to the team, and we are available to do it also in the communities where we collected the information. And I also know that in terms of a general update of the context, the program team also reverts this information back to the donor for them to have an idea or to be updated on how the context is looking like, and to potentially also be prepared if there needs to be any adaptations to what was already settled or agreed.
Great. Both of you have talked a bit about, the rapidity of the collection and analysis of the data. And I wondered if you could talk just a little bit more about the timeliness of this data and challenges to providing timely data to decision makers. So Andrea, would you like to start?
Sure. So the stability score was actually piloted this year between February and March. So we actually collected a lot of lessons learned and different adaptations for our own tool and the way that it was conceived for the next phase. So for us, data collection was actually quite a long process, because many of the indicators were based on data that needed to come from the ground. And this was compounded by the fact that it was the first time that the Congo Humanitarian Analysis Team and the research officers that are not part of the program team and that have not actually been introduced to the community yet, this kind of made the buy-in from the community a bit hard at the beginning. So initially there was a lack of understanding from local leaders as to what we were doing there and what information did we actually want and how this actually connected to the program, right? And this is also quite a new program. So while the community is still adapting and understanding what the activities are about and how it is going to play out for them in the communities, we came in and asked another series of questions. And so based on this, we then decided to come back to the actual initial tool and review its methodology for data collection to be more efficient and for us to be able to provide a more time relevant information, which is actually what we aim to do. It's what we're here for. And this is why the way that we collect data today for the stability score is much more based on secondary sources of information, big data, available open source data sets. And what we've left for primary data collection is smaller. So we've kind of inversed the approach. I think that's what I can say about it in this initial try.
Great. Both of you have mentioned, though, analysis techniques, and maybe some of them being things such as machine learning and such. Could you say a little bit more about how you're analyzing these data streams?
Okay, so thank you, Nancy. Maybe just to complete the previous discussion, in terms of timeliness, one thing that we have done, which is helping us a lot, is the use of the community embedded enumerators. Like I said earlier, they're already in the community, and then we have given them tablets, and then we have they have access to internet, either within the tablets or our monitoring staff go to help them sync it. So every 2 days, we get to know which data is collected. Then they collect data only 4 days in a month. To motivate them, we have two approaches. The first one is we pay a stipend based on the number of households visited. There's a specific figure that we have for each household visited and quality of data submitted. And we have a verification protocol that makes sure the data is of the right quality. Now, in terms of the analysis and what kind of analysis we are producing from this, similar to Andrea, we have used CompCare for the data collection as a platform. We visualize using Power BI. Before visualizing, data cleaning happens within Power BI, and there's a lot of follow-up between our data analyst and the field level monitors. And then the analysis has two aspects to it. The first one is just understanding what is the situation. And then we have standard Power BI reports that are accessible to everybody. But then there are reports that are developed depending on the need or demand by the technical staff. In terms of reducing or making the reports accessible to other frontline staff, there are three approaches we intend to use because we haven't really deployed them fully in the current RIFSA. One of them is translation as much as possible so that the communities can use it. The other one is getting them a physically printed A3 paper that has the result for that, which helps the community embedded enumerators as well as our field staff to do it. And the third thing we are going to do is to develop basic facilitation job aids that ensures there is a standard facilitation approach at the different community levels. In terms of machine learning, that has worked successfully in Malawi, but we don't have enough data to initiate it yet, but the models are still being developed within Ethiopia. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Andrea, would you say more about your secondary data sources and how you're analyzing those?
Yes, so for the pilot, the secondary data sources that we used were mainly for security information, because we knew that, we have humanitarian partners in DRC that are focusing on monitoring the security situation, and they would have much more data than we did. And also sort of, we could look back at previous data to then better understand what was happening now. So the secondary sources of information that we're using, that we used up to this point, and this will change in the future, but not yet. It has been information or data coming from ACLED. We actually have a partnership with ACLED, so we also connect to ACLED data through an API. Information on security incidents coming from INSO, DRC. Also data coming from the VAM from WFP, their vulnerability assessment team. So a lot of the information on market prices and availability of the basic goods actually came from WFP. Yes, and then for this is a lot of the secondary sources of information that we were using. But then the reason why we still kept it mixed is because one of the dimensions has a lot of, it is based a lot on community perception. So the political dimension required a lot of qualitative on the ground data collection to understand the perceptions of the community of humanitarian actors in general, and how was that, like, take the temperature on how was that looking for this particular area at the moment, right? Because this is a very big topic or issue in DRC currently, and so it's actually one of the reasons for lack of access to places. And so that's why a lot of this initial pilot was based on primary data collection, primary qualitative data collection.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. And Greg, to what extent are your monitors looking at security and conflict-related information, and perhaps even peace-building types of efforts?
We look at security to the extent that it directly affects the participants that we serve at household level. There are specific questions about the impact of certain shocks to the different households, but we don't go beyond that. Once we understand that effect, we're able to do it. But it affects our clients directly. For example, one of the major activities we do as a RIFSA in Ethiopia is commodity distribution. And sometimes, even though, yes, we have the community embedded enumerators, in some of the locations, it's impossible to access to distribute the food. So we get to know about these, and the interventions are developed together with the communities. And what we have done in one of the areas is there's a place they can now come out to collect the food. So what we try to do, we try to ask questions that we can actually have as potential response. Otherwise, the community gets fatigued when you keep asking them about things that you cannot actually solve as a program.
Yeah, great. That's absolutely true. And I think that does bring up another question, with respect to the longitudinal nature of MIRA, that you are visiting, the same households over time. How do you keep them interested? How do you keep them engaged?
Wow, that's a tough one. Thank you. Let me talk about how it has been done in Malawi, and then I'll talk about how we intend to do it in Ethiopia. So in Malawi, the communities that were not participants of the program were being given an incentive of a food basket. And then it later changed into something else. And we are still checking on how that is going on. In Ethiopia, all the people we sample from MIRA are activity participants. So we ask them questions, and most of the time we have a way of responding when we get those shocks. So that is not just asking them questions for the sake of questions. The other piece that we think is going to be very influential for us is the idea of community engagement, because that consistent engagement with the community on a quarterly basis to show them how we intend to use their data and to give them feedback about their data, make them not to feel like they're just giving data for no good reason. And we've had instances whereby in some of the implementation areas, communities have demonstrated fatigue in being asked questions, especially when the dot was scratching a couple of months ago. Some staff didn't find it easy to go to the community and ask them any question, because what will you do after that? And, you know, so that's another way of going to do it. But the third way, which I think is the most important way, we will continuously keep asking them, how do we keep them engaged? Because it's still in the early stages. We anticipate that as time goes by, there might be challenges. Another issue within our context is migration. Sometimes during conflict, during drought, households migrate and they come back. We want to start learning on how do we manage that together with the communities.
Yeah, so lots of evolution here. So I think we'd like to turn to some of the questions from the audience. And, you talked, Greg, about how enumerators are collecting data at the household level, and a bit about how that information is presented back to community. Why are the enumerators interested in doing this work? What motivates them?
I think, first of all, we give them some kind of payment on the basis of number of households successfully visited. So they know that for every household they collect, they have something to get to take home. And most of them are like youth, but some of them are youth with children, etc. So they see that as a livelihood option as well, not just collecting data. That's the first thing. And by paying them by the quality of work they do, it also makes them more motivated to do a good job at the collection. The second thing we are doing, we're investing in their careers. We're not just using them for collecting data. We've developed a training module for them so that we keep refreshing their skills every time. We've even we're working with the Viamo to have some IVR way of reaching out to them with refresher modules so that they actually have a skill they are gaining. The third thing we are doing, since they are gaining skill, they're also acting as our community embedded M&D people. So when we need like work for data entry, etc., since they only use 4 days of their month to collect the mirror data, these other days we get them to come. And the last thing we are doing, we have ensured consistent contact with our field level staff. So once every month, they come and meet with our M&D staff who are at the order level, and they get some kind of mentorship and support in filling the questionnaire. That's what keeps them interested as it is now. But as you know, as time goes by, that might end. So what we also decided at the end of each year, we'll be giving them some kind of a motivation package for staying with the program and doing a good job at it. Thank you. We can't hear you, Nancy.
Sorry. This question of community enumerators is an interesting one, the embedded enumerators. And one of the questions I have is, how do you keep bias out of that approach? It's clearly possible that community enumerators get pressure from community to provide information that might be favorable for increased resources. So how do you deal with that risk, that potential risk?
The risk is there, and it might end up being real risk. But the first way of managing the risk is explaining to the community why that data is being collected and how you are going to use it and why you need it to be the correct data. So when the community knows why the data is being collected, the chances of them giving falsified information is less. The second aspect, to make it objective, most of our modules have a verification mechanism. For example, we don't just ask about where do you get your water. We want to see that source where you get water from. We take GPS coordinates. We are able to do that. And something else I didn't mention, we've done an entire mapping of all the services within our implementation area. So we can actually tell which water point they are talking about. So just trying to really make the questionnaires as objective as possible and engaging the community. Now, as you keep going back to the community with the results, they will start seeing the value of honesty and being that. And the last thing is the enumerators are being paid on quality of data. So we have supervision mechanism. Our field level M&D people, they do back checks, at least for 5 households minimum, randomly selected, to re-interview and really check that what is being provided is actually what is really there. And they also are required to do the interview together just to observe if they are interviewing correctly, if they are following the protocols we provided, including protecting clients against COVID-19, among other factors. So those are the mechanisms we have in place. And we have standard checklists that helps us to make sure those things are actually being implemented. Thank you.
Great. And I don't know if you want to say a few words, Andrea, about the quality of information, particularly the primary information that you're getting, and how you assure that.
Sure. So, I mean, from what I understand about Mira, it is actually in that sense quite different from our stability score, just because first we are a support unit that provides analysis or data for programs to then be able to use that data accordingly, right? And so I would say we have less of an interaction with communities, but also because of the nature or the origin story of Congo Hat, we haven't really tapped into data collection coming from the community members themselves, right? I mean, obviously the information comes from community members, but through these various levels of triangulation that we have established within the Congo Hat. And so that's how we ensure that the information the primary data that we are collecting can still be cross-checked and verified through other sources, through our field networks, through even then secondary sources of information, to maintain that sort of assure that quality. It's in a sense, it's similar to what Greg, the embedded enumerators, but we just use it in a very different way, because yes, we have field informants, and our field informants are actually also trained and they understand the scope, like what is their relationship to our staff and what kind of information we want them to pass on to us. And they're also made very clear during our informant training sessions that all of the information that we are getting from them, we are actually then triangulating with other sources that they aren't necessarily aware of who or what's the nature of these other sources. And so they know that they're just one element or one component of a much bigger information system that we're handling.
Great. This is, brought up from some of our participants, this question of protection of the data. Now, we know that data security is a very big issue. And I wonder if you can both say something about how you assure protection and the confidentiality and security of data. Data responsibility.
Okay, I think I can start. So we have a data protection policy within the agency, and during training of the enumerators, we go through that with them and explain to them the process we have in place. But to be more specific, every enumerator uses a tablet to collect the data. That tablet is installed with a software we call AirWatch, which is a mobile device manager to help manage the device and the data within the device and make sure it's protected. We can manage the data remotely from our system. The other thing we do, all of them have username and password. So nobody else apart from them can use their tablets. Before synchronizing the data, they have to meet with the supervisors and they go through it, and then the synchronization is done. Within the system itself, all data that is shared with our reports is de-identified. We don't give any personal identification information to anybody because what we need is the statistics. For the program staff, if we want to respond to a household directly for an issue, in that case, we give again with the clear guidance on how to protect that. When we print reports out, they all come in at the identified way, just statistics and data and the way that people can understand it. So that's how we are managing that. And like I said, when I started, we have a strong data protection policy and guidance within the organization that helps us with that. And also, the first thing we do is consent. We start with consent when we are collecting data with the clients, and we do have 2 rounds of consent. First of all is consent for repeated data collection, and then consent for that particular data collection process.
Andrea?
Sure, I would say similarly to Greg, we also have data protection principles and guidelines within the agency that allow us to sort of be very sure that we are ticking off the checklist, the different data protection and research ethic components when we're in the field, and also when we are handling the raw data. So similarly to Greg as well, we use tablets to collect the data from on the ground, and that is then through the server. Then when the data reaches the server, it is directly anonymized, and the research officers that were in charge of the data collection also had tablets that required a password for them to input the data. That is one aspect which is quite similar to just the traditional data protection and research ethics guidelines. And then another important thing for us is the fact that all of the data, even the qualitative data, then gets transformed into sort of a binary yes or no to be able to answer to the indicator that will automatically add to the average, to the global score. So we don't, I mean, other than the fact that our data protection guidelines are followed, we just need the specific answer that was given that can then help us fill in the yes or no question in our scoring system to then get the final average score for an indicator. So for us, it makes it even easier to have the data completely anonymized, because we don't need that information. And we're only just, you can even see the indicators within the stability score as research questions. We just want a closed yes, no research question from the number of participants we got answers from.
Great. I guess there are two really last remaining issues. I've tried to group the questions from the audience. There are two last remaining issues. One is the forums and mechanisms that you all share your data with. What are those? And do you actually survey user satisfaction with your products and services? So if you wanted to speak to that first, Greg?
Yes, starting with question 2, we haven't done that yet. We are not yet at that level of checking user satisfaction, but what we've done user consultation before even working on the data. One of the important steps that is embedded in Mira is questionnaire contextualization. And this basically means meeting the different potential users and identifying whether the questionnaire we have responds directly to their needs. And then changing that questionnaire based on the feedback that you get. And in this case, we consulted the government from the Kebele level, Woreda, and zone. And then we also consulted other actors within Ethiopia. And also we consulted our technical leads. That's why in our module, you'll see things like off-farm and wages. Those were seen as important to them. But in terms of checking for user satisfaction, we are not yet at that point still. On the first question, which was about, can you come again? First question.
The forums and mechanisms for sharing data.
Yeah, so there are many forums at different levels. Starting from the community level, there's the community engagement forums, which we have a structure there called the Food Security Task Forces. And then we also have early warning committees at the community. That's the first area because they are the primary people affected by the data that we collect. And then we have got other forums of engagement with other stakeholders, which we intend to share. Like we have the very structured review mechanism, which is multiple donors and government together. We'll be sharing that data there so that the teams can start thinking of intervention approaches. The other forums are internal within CRS. We will be sharing in our quarterly reflection events with our technical leads so that they can take action on the data. And more forums will keep coming as the demand for the data increases. Thank you.
Andrea.
Yes, Nancy, I kind of wanted to better understand what you mean by user satisfaction.
Yeah, I mean, do you consult the decision makers that you're targeting with respect to, you know, how they're using the data that the information that you provide?
Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, we do actually. Well, for the initial pilot, a lot of the indicators were identified in collaboration with our end user, which was the program team, because they have specific information needs related to governance, water stakeholders or business owners that have some kind of relationship with water systems. And so, yes, we obviously, it has been an open communication, not only on how, I mean, not only presenting the results, but also understanding, well, how was this used? So that we can come back to the tool and see where we need to maybe review some things to be very specific on the information that we're getting for it to be as useful as possible for the program teams. And in terms of the different forums and platforms that we're using, most of them are internal meetings done by the program team. So they're monthly meetings Their workshops or strategy workshops for a specific component. Maybe it's governance, maybe it is the water component of SWASA. We do have a space to, again, talk about how the context has evolved and how it particularly affects the different activities that are being implemented. We have also been given a space in the program's context updates with the donor to actually present the context every time that we've been able to update the score, which is normally we try to keep it within a 3-month frequency. Yeah, so these are the platforms that we're using, and we have definitely consulted the final user.
Great. There are a number of questions around cost and sustainability of these approaches and exit plans. And I wonder, I know you can't share specific cost information, but can you tell us a little bit about the size of the teams and your plan for transfer of these functions in the future?
So I think I can start. We have 44 community embedded enumerators based on the sample. We use them for metadata collection, but we also intend to build their capacity to use them for other things. They remain in the community. They remain a resource to the community even after CRS exits the program. In terms of affordability of them, we want to run a model that government can adopt in the long run, like we have seen the uptake in Malawi. So we have consulted with government of the local government at capital level and other level. And as we work on the sustainability strategy, one of our strategies is to hand over this process to them in the long run. That discussion has started. The nature of how that handover will happen has not been fully unearthed because we are still in discussions, because the data is adding value at the moment. And the idea is there are many approaches that can take moving forward. The rest of the staff are all part of the CRS team, M&D and technical team. For example, the environment and NRM staff are the ones who work with the community enumerators to facilitate the data use at community level. That's part of their regular work. We have a specific outcome that is monitoring the shock. So it's not an extra resource on us, but the information that comes from that, we work to make sure like the government has access to it and owns it. So that is the current status of it. And we keep making the sustainability strategy stronger as we move along and as the adoption of the methodology continues.
Andrea, please.
Yes, so in terms of the size and cost of this project, so we are quite a small team that actually needs to cover a very large area on a daily basis to monitor the evolution of the context in Eastern DRC. So this is kind of the stage that we're at right now, is reviewing the tool so it can be more sustainable. So we already know that in terms of exit strategy or transitioning, we are not under any specific program. So it actually doesn't matter whether one program finishes or not, because we are continuously just collecting information on the context that could be useful for other users and not just, for example, today, SWASA team members. And this is where we're at right now. We are, as I was saying, sort of inverting the way the tool was conceived, and now a lot of the indicators will be answered to through quantitative secondary sources of information. This will help us be more effective and actually present more real-time results that can be useful for humanitarian development and peace-building actors. So other than changing the kind of data that we're collecting and adapting those indicators, we are also expanding the scope of the information we are collecting. So if we started out with 4 dimensions of study, today or currently we are looking at maybe evaluating 6 to 7 dimensions of study, which will give a more complete screenshot of a particular geographic area for any actor that is intervening there. And so this is how we're intending to make this tool sustainable in the future. And also just in terms of efficiency, we, as I said, we're quite a small team, and this is one of the many products that we put out. And some of the other products that we put out are deep dives and are thematic deep dives that do require more primary data collection and even like in-person observation and going to the field. And so this is the solution we found for these 2 issues: exit strategy and also cost and manpower of the tool.
Great, such an exciting discussion of new developments and what we've been doing now for 30 or 40 years in terms of monitoring. As Frank mentioned, these are all interrelated, and great discussion. And I think that that there's so much more that we certainly hope to keep this conversation going. There are 2 more sessions. Frank, do you have some final words here as the close?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Andrew and Greg, for sharing your valuable insights. This has been a really wide-ranging conversation. We've gone from really kind of broad programmatic implications of the information down to the very technical, how we analyze the data, how we provide incentives to enumerators, data privacy, which is really important. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for their contribution. The questions were great as well. And if we have time, we can get to some of the other questions that we weren't able to hear. But again, I wanted to thank Andrea and Greg for sharing their insights, and Nancy for your able guidance of the conversation. It was really great. We're almost out of time, but before everybody takes off, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this session so that we can improve on our future events. There is a very short survey that's going to be pasted into the chat box. It will take less than 2 minutes to complete, and we really would love to ask everybody to take that time and give us some immediate feedback. Also, if you haven't yet, please register for the sessions tomorrow and Thursday. Tomorrow, we will hear about the use of data in contingency planning. And on Thursday, we will reflect on the use of humanitarian data for development programs and the whole issue of sharing data across pillars under the HDP nexus. We will keep the Zoom meeting open and play some music in the background as you complete the survey. Thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you tomorrow and Thursday. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.